Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. That's a shit intro, isn't it? What a fucking weird intro that is. So, as much requested, we're going to go for the KX250F setup. So, we've got a member of the OBPK Kawasaki teaming. He's our residential mechanic, as it were, because me and the other member, Will, have absolutely zero fucking clue when it comes to remotely setting up a motorbike. So, I'd say the game's pretty spot on when it comes to real life. So I'll let Ben intro himself and talk about just general suspension to begin with and how he got into it, and then we'll run you through the setup. So what kind of talk about your involvement in the sport and kind of what got you into a bit of a spanner wanker.
Yeah. I've been racing since I was a wee boy. Not particularly good at it, so decided to go down the technical know-how route as opposed to just the out-and-out speedster route. So yeah, just out of curiosity, really, there's just the sheer ability to make something fast just by knowing how to manipulate certain aspects. So suspension is obviously highly technical, and it's one of the main aspects of a bike that you can modify to actually make a bike better considerably. It's relatively straightforward yourself when you know what you're doing. It gets more complex when you go into sort of shim stack design and what have you. So I tend to just stick to the basic clicker settings. So when I come to MX bikes, I just try to apply my real life understanding of suspension dynamics and try and keep it relatively realistic. So I know a lot of people, especially the fast people, tend to run kind of out their settings, huge sag numbers, etc.
Yeah.
But I like to try and keep it within the realms of what I deem to be realistic. So, realistic sag numbers, realistic fork height numbers. The average Joe hasn't got access to longer swing arms, so keep it pretty much in the middle of the road in that sense, and just rely on rebounding compression damping adjustment.
How would you say this compares to kind of real life bike setup? I know it's only a basic simulator and stuff, but would you say it's pretty spot on?
Pretty good, yeah. I mean, there's a few cases where obviously the numbers of clickers are out. So in real life, you'd have 24, 28, whatever the brand of suspension has. Whereas this, you have 14 on rebound and I want to say 24 on compression.
Okay.
So you have to just assume that every one click of rebound is equivalent to 2 clicks in real life and just kind of do it that way. It's difficult. We're actually seeing any kind of graphs. You can't tell this sort of damping curve, so to speak. So I kind of do a lot of this by feel in terms of the game, which is kind of what I do in real life anyway. I do what's something called bracketing.
Yeah.
So bracketing basically is when you get to a certain, you start off with like a sort of default, and then you go large jumps each way until you find the usable range, and then within that usable range you sort of tailor it to your preference, because there's a point where maximum grip isn't the same as maximum control.
Okay.
So a lot of people, if you on a suspension dyno graph set it up for maximum grip, a lot of people would return the suspension and say that they don't like it because it's too active.
Right.
Which would make it feel skittish. So what you have then is you end up sort of stiffening and slowing the suspension to a point where it feels like it's got more control, and riders tend to sort of err on the side of control over grip, but it's always kind of a payoff stance. There's a crossover point. So bracketing allows you to find the crossover points of grip and control that you feel most comfortable with.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So I myself tend to run faster rebound for the grip, whereas people like Will within this game would tend to run slower rebound because he prefers the control.
Okay.
And a lot of the faster riders tend to have quite slow rebound, quite stiff suspension. But I feel like that takes away from the whole simulation idea of it. So I tend to, again, work within what would be like a usable range, so to speak.
Yeah, I would say ability-wise, we're probably above the average player. Will's quicker again, but would you say this setup would translate well for a beginner compared to the standard setup?
Yeah, reasonably. I think if you send the settings to a beginner, they're a beginner. You could give them the best setup in the game that the fastest kid's riding on, and it won't help them.
That's true. It'd be
because they
interesting.
still have to learn the game. But in terms of, I think a relatively good balance between sort of control, feel, and grip is good. It's not too far from default.
Yeah.
I tend to be more extreme than you in terms of what I like in my setup. So I tend to go to the stiffer, the faster. You're a bit more in the middle. Will's a bit more slower, softer kind of. So it's quite good in the sense it kind of ties in, because in real life, Will's very much like that as well. Whereas he's such a smooth rider that he gets away with higher gears and softer suspension. Whereas I'm heavier, a lot less fit, but for the 1 or 2 laps I can do, I tend to be a lot more sprinty.
Yeah.
So it translates to riding style in this game. Obviously, the terms are all real life terms, and this is a game, but it kind of translates over because my riding style in the game is similar to how it is in real life, and Will's is similar to his in real life. So the setups translate.
Yeah, it's
to
funny
that
how that
extent as
works.
well.
It speaks volumes to the game, really, how well all of it transfers
Yeah,
over.
yeah, it does. It's a very good engine in terms of physics and just the principles of suspension in terms of like bracketing and understanding that faster rebound is more grip but feels more lively, so therefore that might be a negative to you.
Yeah.
And understanding that suspension is always a compromise and is also personal. So when I get set up for ourselves on the 250, I set it up for what I'd like, and then when I gave it to you, I give you 1 or 2 clicks here and there that I think would suit you better because you're very middle of the road in terms of style. And then when I gave it to Will, I kind of tailor it to him depending on his feedback, basically. Which is again what you do in real life. So that kind of principle carries over as well.
Yeah, and well, without you giving us setups, we'd have been absolutely lost. And I'm sure a lot of people that are coming to MX bikes feel the exact same way, because if you know nothing about setup at all, it's so easy to get it completely wrong and think you're just terrible at the game. So I think this video would definitely help a few people out.
Yeah, I mean, my key piece of advice to an absolute wet behind the ears noob is get used to it. Don't mess around with it. Set the default, set the sag, off you go. Don't overthink the suspension setup.
Yeah.
Learn to play it first, and as you get up to speed, as you start getting consistency, you start playing with it then. Because up until that point, you're like a fish out of water.
Well, fuck me, I still feel that way. But then so the bike we've got is a KX250F, and would you say this setup translates at all to any of the other 250Fs, or would you say this is solely towards a Kawasaki?
It may translate to KTM's, because KTM's have the same sort of sag ranges.
Right.
It's like a 105 or 250 Kawasaki. I tend to run 103 sags, but KTM's like 105. But the other manufacturers, I've not really had much experience with Yamaha, so I don't really know. I'd have to play it to get a feel for it.
Yeah.
But once you kind of get a feel for you get a feel for it and it feels good, you can then go to any other bike and kind of take the principles of how it works and apply it to that bike. So you'll come up with different settings, but you get a similar feel.
Yeah.
So like suspension action, shock action, how it squats under power, how it turns, how much bite you have on the front. That's almost a feel, as close to a feel as you can get in a game.
Yeah.
Because obviously, it's the same with any motorsports game, Forza, Gran Turismo. In your head, you're feeling the traction, but in reality, you're just going off of the screen and the rumble.
Yeah.
So the same sort of thing. You get a feel, and you can replicate that feel across the brands. But you have to learn that feel first. But like I said, for a brand new noob, just learn the game. Don't sweat it. If you want to put a setup in, because you're a bit of a tweaky, fiddly like myself, try our setup. It's not such a huge deviation from the norm that you'll be like really relearning the game again. It's quite a good, slightly more advanced pro-am kind of setup, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely. I'd probably recommend sticking with one bike for a while as well. There doesn't seem to be huge variance, but I think the Kawasaki is a good middle ground bike for anyone.
Yeah.
So
like I ride 250F Kawasaki.
Yeah.
On the game, 450 Kawasaki, and I also recently done quite a lot of riding on the Suzuki RM 250 two-stroke.
Yeah.
And that setup's numerically night and day different.
Yeah.
But I still have a feel of the bike that allows me to ride same lap times or better than I would on the other two. So, but I've had to learn the feel by sticking on the 250F Kawasaki for 200, 300 hours maybe.
Yeah, I'd probably recommend anyone new to do the same as well, because although it is just a game, there is a significant difference between the bikes, and
Yeah.
I think otherwise you're going to get, even when you jump on a 450, you get the timing of the jumps wrong, how to brake properly, even how to set up in corners. So I probably would stick with one, obviously, just to get used to the game. So we'll go through the tabs. My setup's called High Point setup only because you gave me the setup at High Point. I call it that, and it
Yeah.
translates well to everything. I think the bike is super stable, super solid, and even as my speeds got better, I felt no need to adjust anything other than sag numbers to suit the track that I'm on. So yeah, overall, I think this setup's super solid. The general tab. So we'll start with fuel. The only time me and you will ever change that is length of motos, but occasionally the weight will change, won't it? If you lower it
Yeah.
higher.
Sometimes at different tracks, you get different sag readings based on what you have your preload set at. It's always worth going into the test tab to see what your sag is on that particular track. And if I'm like it's fluttering between 103 and 104, I'll probably leave it. But if it's fluttering 102 to 103, I'll add fuel to add weight to get it to sit on 103.
Okay.
That's the only time I'll adjust. Or obviously the opposite. I'd lower the fuel if I want to go from 104, 103 to 103. Yeah, most races online, what, they 5 laps?
Yeah.
I mean, we do the longest races I've experienced is like 20 minutes plus 2.
Yeah.
I think we've done a couple of 30 minutes plus 2, haven't we?
And we have run out of fuel on 5 liters, which
Yeah.
is good for about
So
27 minutes.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, generally speaking, you have a bit of leeway there to sort of fine tune the sag numbers if needs to be. But that's the only reason we ever really adjust it.
We never need to look at static sag or anything like that. It's just the race sag, isn't it, on the rear?
Yeah, static sag is just set in spring rate.
Okay.
So, I get my sag figures, ideal race sag figures from loads of online sources and real life bike tests, which isn't ideal in a game because obviously it isn't real life. But I feel like if you can use that and work around it in terms of setup, then you can get a pretty good semi-realistic setting, so to speak.
Yeah.
So I tend to get the figures off there. So Race Tech advises 4mm preload on nearly every bike apart from 450s where it's 5mm preload. So I tend to work around that. And then the static sag, if it's between 30 and 35mm, you've got the right spring rate.
Okay, that's interesting.
If you hit the race sag with the static sag at 30 to 35, you're on point. If it's like 40, 45mm, then you need to change it.
Mine's on 39 rear, 29 front at the moment. For static.
On static?
Yeah.
What's the race sag?
104 and 61, fluttering between 60 61.
See, at that point, I'd go up a spring rate.
Okay, so what would
the front.
You change the front?
Just got one.
Cool. We'll get to that in a second then. So tires you can't do anything with, so it's just mid soft one. Maybe they'll implement that into the game. I don't know. But tire pressures, I've never played with them at all. Have you ever adjusted any of them?
I have a fiddle here and there, just a little play. I tend to stick, like I said earlier, for new people who you need to spend a long amount of time on one bike. I spent the entire first 300 hours on just 12.3 psi.
Oh, okay.
Which is the default. So I just learnt to ride like that. So now occasionally I will, just out of curiosity, I'll just drop the front PSI one click to get a little bit more front end bite if the track's like a supercross or something. I'll drop the PSI. But yeah, generally I keep it at default.
I do need to change mine from bar to PSI because mine are on bar. So if you are confused, I have got the wrong settings if you are watching this.
Depends where you're watching it. In America, bar makes sense.
Yeah,
PSI is for us Euro metric freaks.
So talk about brakes right now. We're on an 18mm front disc. Is there ever any need to change that?
I change it occasionally for supercross, but then I've got a very sprinty kind of style where I'll just charge into stuff and brake late. Will doesn't ever touch the brakes and just carry speed around corners like Stefan Everts. So the numbers correspond with lever travel. So 60mm means the lever travels less distance before it bites. So in theory, it gives you a sharper bite.
Right.
80mm is default, and then 20mm means a bit further. So obviously, it takes longer to bite. So it's a more gradual, progressive brake. I've just learned on 18mm for outdoors. That's simple as that. Like it's sometimes like if you ever watch any of the sort of Living the Dream Supercross on YouTube, there's a great episode where Dungey keeps chasing his tail for setup, and sometimes you just have to learn to sort of ride with it.
Yeah.
Similar to that in this case, like just learn for the default, and then you can make tiny incremental changes to make it that much more suited to you personally, and then you're laughing.
Yeah, I've never touched the front disc and the
No.
leverage, and I've never needed to. If anything, as I've got quicker, I've only learnt to use the brakes when I've got quicker, and even then, they've been plenty fine for everything
Mm,
you've done.
exactly.
And again, you can't change anything on the other stuff, so hope perhaps that will change. I don't know. Technically, the game's still in beta, so we'll see how that goes. So that covers general. Um, and then we'll go over to suspension. So we've got front suspension, spring rate at the moment's on 5. So would you ever change anything there?
Yeah, so on my RM 252 straight when I play it, I've gone up. I think it's 2, maybe 3 spring rates on the front.
Okay.
From the default, just to get the 30 mil static, 60 mil race sag numbers. Rear shock I've gone up 1, I think, to get the static and race numbers in line. So sometimes you do need to check that.
Okay. And then bump. Sorry, do you want to carry on?
I'd say if you select a default to compare it to, is
Yeah, it will.
yours on default, the Forks with spring rates? It's 5.0 default, I'm pretty sure it is.
Yeah, it's default.
Yeah, so you're on default there.
And then we've got bump, which the default was on the front, which was 9. We've gone to 8. So what does bump actually do?
So bump is it resists the fork collapsing when you hit a bump. So by collapsing, I mean the fork compressing.
Right.
In the act of absorbing a bump. The higher the number, the more free it is.
Okay.
So the lower the number, the more resistance it is to it. So in theory, it's harder. The lower the number, the harder it feels.
So if you like a stiff setup, then you want a slightly lower bump.
Yeah, it's oversimplistic in the sense that the suspension is either linear or progressive. So the further through the stroke you go, the stiffer it gets anyway. So if you go too soft, it'll feel stiff. So sometimes stiffer is softer, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Because the first part of the travel is the softest and requires the least amount of resistance to move. So if you can keep it in the first part of the travel, it will feel plusher, although it will be higher in the stroke and actually resist bumps more.
That's interesting.
So forks to me are quite important because they're the first thing that hits the bumps. They're also they hold the bike up when you brake.
Okay.
And I don't like a lot of dive. So I don't see any benefit in the brake dive. Whereas if you're accelerating and the bike squats, there is a benefit to that.
Right.
So I tend to run the fork stiffer than the rear and also faster on the rebound than the rear.
That makes sense. I know Ping recently in the CRF 2021 450 testing said they actually made it stiffer to make it feel softer. So that kind of talks about what you were saying there.
Yeah, so it's to do with the damping of it. So obviously the spring has a resistance to it, but if you just had the spring, it would oscillate back and forth uncontrolled. So the damping is a controlled collapse of the suspension rather than just a free-for-all collapse. So and the opposite of that is the rebound. So once the suspension is compressed, you have all that stored energy within the spring. It has to then unload that energy. If there was no damping, it would just ping out like a pogo stick.
Huh.
So what the rebound damping does is it controls the extension of the forks back to fully extended.
Oh, that makes sense. And then
so I tend to have mine quite fast.
Yeah.
Because I like it to undulate and follow the ground. People like Will and yourself would prefer a feeling of control where it's less light feeling, so it feels more planted, so you slow down the rebound. So I think you've got it. What you got on 7, is it?
Rebound's on 8. That's the default.
8. Yeah. So 7 is middle of the range because maximum is 14. Right. So you got you're 1 faster than middle. So which is equivalent to 2 faster in real life, but we won't go there. We'll just use these numbers. And I'm probably around 9. I flick back and forth between 8 and 9 depending on track roughness.
I might give 9 a go just to see how it feels, and it's amazing what one click on here does. Because as you
Yeah,
said, it's a couple more in real life. So although this isn't amazingly far from the default, a couple clicks can make a big difference,
yeah.
especially depending on riding style.
I always do a what I call a 2-for-1. So whatever direction I do the compression in, if I do 2 clicks in any direction, I do one the opposite on the rebound.
Okay.
So if I go stiffer 2 clicks on the compression, I'll go faster one on the rebound.
Right. That makes sense.
Um, in real life, there is a crossover between the circuits. So compression damping circuit and the rebound damping circuit has an effect on one another.
Right.
So sometimes you could actually stiffen the fork by slowing the rebound. If you want to do, it's almost the equivalent of something along the lines like a half click. So it's a very subtle difference. But sometimes if you go too stiffer on the forks in real life, that could be too stiff. But you back it out one on the rebound, it can feel softer because it's actually traveling through the stroke easier.
Right.
So I do that in this game as well. Whether that's right or wrong, I don't know, but it seems to work for me. I don't really have any severe front end issues. So
No, I don't think any of us do, to be honest. If anything, that's been I noticed I tuck the front a lot on a lot of stuff, and maybe it's a bit of everything getting better around the suspension, but
yeah,
the front feels
yeah,
very stable. It's just a good overall setup. So preload we've got 4,
yeah.
the default's at 3. So what are we looking for in preload?
Preload is just sag setting.
Right. Okay.
It's just sag setting. So yeah, this is what Racetech recommends on their Racetech spring rate calculator in terms of what fork sag should be if you install one of their fork products in real life.
Okay.
So I just use that as a benchmark that I can use, so then I can tune around it.
Right.
Um, yeah, it basically when you change the sag, what it changes on the suspension is it pre-squashes it.
Right.
And by doing so, you increase the amount of energy required for the initial movement. It doesn't change how stiff the suspension is. It just changes how much you need to overcome the first bit of movement to get it actually moving.
Oh, I see. That
Which
makes
is how
sense.
how it affects the sag.
Yeah. Whenever we set our race sag, we always use the preload on the rear. But would you ever change it on the front, or would you say the 3-4 clicks is about base, and then like you said, just adjust from there?
Yeah, I'd normally leave it about 4. I don't really mess with that too much at all, really.
Okay.
I stick it at 4 and leave it because it's consistent. I know what I'm playing with then and what I'm getting.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then fork oil, we've got 105 with the default being 100.
Yeah, so this one's a bit converse to what you expect it to be. So 105 mil isn't actually more oil; it's technically less oil in this game.
Huh.
So if you hover over it in game, it gives you a little information bubble.
Yeah, mine's not for some reason. I don't know why. It
Yeah.
normally does. Oh, hang on.
Yes.
No, it did say. You just got to hold it there. Decreasing the fork oil measurement increases the spring stiffness in the last part of fork travel.
Yeah. Basically, in real life, all suspension, whether it's got air spring or coil spring, has an air suspension element to it because it has oil in there, and then you have the air that's left over because it's never brimmed.
Right.
There's always a gap between the oil and the top of the fork cap. Now, air is hugely progressive in comparison to a coil spring, so it just gets stiffer and stiffer and stiffer and stiffer and stiffer to the point where it's not compressible. So it actually aids in bottom out and resisting it.
Right.
In this game, I found that if you remove the oil, so you reduce the oil figure, it just caused the forks to blow out. When you landed on big jumps, it just blew the
Okay.
front wheel out from underneath you.
Yeah.
So I've gone 5 mil more than default, just so it actually allows the forks to use its full range of motion,
That makes sense. It'd be
rather than
interesting.
getting too stiff too late and later in the stroke.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see they ever implement air suspension into this, or they're going to just stick with the standard stuff.
Well, the KTM and the Husqvarna is the only bikes that come with air suspension in real life as a stock suspension, and they have spring rates on this game. So
Okay.
I don't know whether it's just easier for Piboso to just leave it as springs.
Yeah, most probably.
I mean, people playing this game, 90% of them are into the tweaky tech side like I would be. So it's easier just to let them have the spring rates because it's a common measurement between all brands then.
Makes sense. So going over to the rear, we've got 54 clicks, or is that the base setting? Yeah, so we've got 54. I haven't changed that at all. When would you change the rear spring?
When the sag numbers are out.
Okay.
If you can't get anywhere near 30 to 35 mil static and what you want your race sag to be, you have to then change it.
That makes sense. So you just use that as kind of a sag marker then.
Yeah, that's how you do it in real life as well. It's if you have too much sag, if you have over 40 mil sag to reach your race sag numbers, it means the spring's too soft
Okay.
because you're having to wind it down more. So, yeah, it's just a way of gauging what spring rate you should be running.
Right. Okay. So
It would be useful to know the rider's weight in this game, so you
yeah,
could spring it for that. But I don't know whether that'd be because it has to be a theoretical weight
yeah. I'm guessing
for it to act on the chassis.
yeah, they're all the same as they must all be the same as default. It'd be interesting to see there's difference between even 450 and 250 weights, or if it's just a standard model. It'd be interesting to see how they even calculated that on the bike as well. That must have been a fair amount of work for them.
Yeah, I think there's something on the forums. I need to look into it really, just out of
Yeah,
curiosity.
I've never even considered that, to be honest. It's quite interesting. And then slow bump, we've got 9, which is the default again.
Yeah, sometimes I go softer with that. I don't mind a back end squatting. I think it's in real life and in this game. If it's a rear end squats, the wheelbase increases. You're also getting more drive as it sinks down into the ground. You get a lower center of gravity with the rough stuff. There's more. The only real issue is bottoming. So the reason I leave it default or go one softer is because as long as it's not bottoming on faces of jumps and landings, then you're within the ballpark. It's all down to feel then. Because I play first person as well, I kind of like the rear end just to do what it does without any drama.
Yeah, I think that's a big, because a lot of people now, especially even the top guys, are all running first person. So I run third, so I guess I can kind of see what's going on, whereas you can't. So
Yeah, so I kind of have to set it up to a point of where it just does what it does, and I can just forget about it.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think, like I was saying earlier, with grip and control and the difference in feel, it's better for me in first person to have the rear more controlled and sacrifice some of the grip for the sake of it being less active.
Yeah, that makes sense. So if you are running first or third person, that's something for you guys to consider on stability on the rear as well. And then fast bump, we've got 2. The default's 2.25 turns.
Yeah, I tweak that now and again. In real life, it has an effect on how the bike handles square edge chop, abrupt landings, short stuff, sort of whoops, that kind of thing. It also has an effect on the bike's attitude when riding at speed. So the softer it is, the more the back end sags.
Okay.
In motion. So therefore, adding stability to it. So I tend to run a little bit less, maybe. Sometimes I go 1 3/4. If a track is like something like Lommel, where it's fast and whooped out, 2 1/4 back to default, just so it gets a little bit more choppered out. Again, it's something you have to have a little fiddle with, have a little play with, but basic sort of setup that you've got is kind of in the middle, pretty. It's not too far deviated from standard, but what we have done has been done for a reason.
Yeah.
In terms of handling the bike.
Yeah, I definitely, the setup we've got now, if I ever hit some rust stuff, I like maybe just a slightly stiffer bike overall, because I know it can dance around, it squats well into a corner, and then I know I can hammer out, and equally when it's soft as well, it's not all over the place at the same time. So yeah, this tends to handle kind of everything really, really well, which is good.
Going back to the low speed on the rear, slow bump, if you're having an issue under acceleration out corners, you find the front wheels lifting or it's washing a lot, go harder on the rear slow bump, because it'll force the rear end to stay up and therefore the front end down. So the rear end affects the front and the front affects the rear as well.
Okay, I wouldn't say that's too much of an issue on a 250F in my experience. It's more, I think, 450 issue.
My 450 setup tends to be stiffer all round.
Yeah.
Because of the gyroscopic effects on the chassis.
Yeah. And then preload, we've got 11 mil. That's simply just set race sag, right?
Yeah, race sag. Yeah. So anywhere between 103 and 105 on the KX250F.
Yeah.
I like mine around the 103, 104 mark. Just because it forces the front end to bite a bit more. Everyone's different. Try it.
Yeah.
See what you like.
I think 104 is about right for me as well. 103. Occasionally, I've played with 105, 106, and it's okay. But I definitely think 104. I notice that difference. It's crazy for just how small difference it makes. But I noticed that the front end feels so much worse in one aspect or another for just a couple of mil difference.
Yeah, that's sometimes if your front end's playing up, it's nothing to do with the front end.
Yeah.
Check your sag numbers. And sometimes the rear end, you can't get the rear end feeling good whatsoever. Check your fork numbers, because it could be translating too much of the energy back on itself and vice versa. So
Cool, cool. All right, so I'd say that pretty much covers suspension. So we'll move on to gear ratios and front sprocket. So mine's all default apart from I run a 51 rear to sprocket. So would you ever play about the actual single gear ratios themselves, or are we just looking at
yeah,
drive ratio?
I know I've messed around with them a fair bit, to be honest. Outdoors, I occasionally would run a 14.2 front and like a 51 rear just to get longer gearing.
Okay,
One tooth on the front, one tooth larger on the front is equivalent to 3 smaller on the rear, I think it is.
right,
So it's a big ratio difference. So 1350 is standard for most outdoor tracks, other than maybe Unadilla or the really high speed stuff. I'd say go up a tooth on the rear just to get the bike up and out the corners a bit quicker, a bit more
yeah,
lively. You're losing a couple of mile an hour a gear, so on the average track that doesn't matter. The acceleration is more important than the top speed. So just make sure you're good at shifting and get going.
yeah. Would you ever play about with the individual gears we've got here, or are we just looking at front and rear sprocket rather than the
Just front and rear
individual?
sprockets. You can get lost in there, and you can cause it to have ridiculous flat spots, and
Yeah,
it's just too easy to make it worse rather than better.
yeah. Okay, so that's drivetrain covered, and then the final we got others. So we got fork offset at 23 mil.
Yeah.
What does fork offset even change? What if I played about with that?
Fork offset is in real life it's to do with the clamps, and the offset is how far in front the center of the fork tubes are compared to the center of the steering nut.
Right.
So 23 mils further forward, and what it does is it increases rake, I think is rake, or trail, might be trail. So the higher the number, the more stable it is.
Okay.
But it also means you get more flip flop. So you know how a chopper, Harley Davidson, in slow speeds, when they do tight turns, the steering wants to flop to one side,
Right.
and there's a resistance to go back to center. But when it's at center, it's incredibly stable.
Yeah.
That's because it's got a huge offset. But the
Ah,
lower
makes
the
sense.
offset, it's quicker handling because everything's pulled in tighter to the sort of center of the head tube. But it also has a similar effect to a trolley caster, where it wants to go straight more. It kind of
Okay.
snaps back up a bit more.
So you might struggle in the corners a bit then.
The lower the offset, you'll probably find corners better,
Okay.
but you'll find it flops in and flops out quicker.
Right.
So
Okay.
it makes a reaction time less, so it feels a little bit more lively. So for ages I had 22 mil, just for entire like first 200 hours,
Yeah.
and then I thought, nah, 23, I've got to sacrifice some of this cornering for
Yeah.
stability. So for Supercross, I will go to 22 mil.
I think I tried 22 but went back to 23. I just didn't like dipping into the corners as hard, and to be honest that 23 is standard seems pretty stable. So that
Yeah,
seems like a good
I do
overall.
22 in Supercross. I'll do 52 wrist sprocket in Supercross. But for outdoors, I have. I went back to standard wrist sprocket outdoors for 250F for certain tracks, and I found
Okay.
that to be a lot better. But I will tend to do 23 mil offset just because it's half the time the corners are. If you roll the corners properly, take the right lines, you're not stopping starting. It's not. It's more a flow, so the offset's less important.
That makes sense. So we got fork height at 5 mil. So
Yeah.
that's again standard base setup.
Yeah, so that's how high the fork top is in real life above the clamp.
Right.
So by raising it up, you're lower in the front end, but what you're doing is you're also bringing the front wheel into you because of the angle at
Oh,
which
I see.
the forks come out at an angle. They're never straight up and down. They come out at an angle, which is known as trail, which is distance to center of the fork lug is from center of gravity, I think it is. So by raising it up, you're actually bringing the forks up and therefore the wheel back on itself. So you're bringing it closer to the front. So you're changing the trail of the bike. The higher up it is, the more front end pressure you'll get. So the weight's further forward. So you get a load of front end grip, but you can overpower the front.
Okay.
So you start finding it has in braking bumps and stuff, you get a head shake.
Yeah.
And it doesn't want to settle in the rough. It kind of front end dances around a lot.
So we're looking for more of a smoother track for a higher fork height then.
Yeah, I wouldn't go much lower than 5 mil. I've Supercross, I do 6, maybe 7, but that's Supercross, so it's a different setup altogether.
Yeah.
Outdoors, 5 mil up to 0 to flush, depending on how you like it. You could set, like, using these setup tips, you could run a bike that's fully choppered out, but will never get out of shape on a lap track like Lommel.
Yeah.
It's all down to personal preferences, but I tend to, for outdoors, I run between 5 and 3 mil.
Yeah, I think three is pretty decent. I will go back to 3 for a while. I'm currently running 5, but that 3 and 5 range seems quite stable.
Yeah, it depends on your speed as well. I've noticed as I've got quicker, I've had to change my focus from front end weighting to go to back to standard, or even past standard to a more stable setup, because I'm coming into stuff quicker. So the stability carries into corners now
Makes
because
sense.
I'm going that much quicker. So the setup will sort of mutate along with your riding if you're conscious of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, 5 mil is a banging starting point. If you feel like it's too, if you find the front end pushes a lot, try 4. It could be that instead of having not enough front tire bite, you're having too much.
Yeah, I think I
It's
need to.
overpowering it.
I might try 4 because the only offset I seem to get with my riding is that I occasionally tuck the front, and that could be down to poor line choice and over leaning a little bit as well. But I probably will change that a little bit just because I do.
Try it.
99% of my offset are front end pushes, so that probably
Just
just
have a play with it.
yeah.
It's experimenting, mate.
And then swing arm length, you've got 1. Would you ever change that?
No, I leave it as standard. I mean, the theory behind it and the technicality of it is that the longer the swing arm, the more weight you put on the front wheel.
Right.
So, like I said earlier, the average Joe hasn't got access to longer swing arms. That's like a factory edition.
Right.
Jeffrey Hurlins, Antonio Cairoli, they all run longer swing arms standard. But everyone else doesn't have access to it. The closest you'll get to it is if you run the chain adjuster blocks right at the back of the swing arm. But just such a negligible difference, I don't think it's worth including in the game, because it's too easy to do what I would call a cheater setup, which it isn't a cheater setup because it's available to everyone, but
Yeah.
it comes away from the center line of what I would call realism, and it goes down the route of being exploiting the shortcomings of the physics engine in this game.
Yeah. Yeah. I
So
definitely.
that's a controversial topic for another time, I feel. But
yeah, that's a rant topic.
yeah. So I would stick with 1 just because it's just it anchors it to a form of amateurist realism for me, I suppose.
Which is the reason we play the simulator in the first place.
Oh, exactly.
Like
if it wasn't for realism, we'd be playing bloody MXGP.
Yeah, bagging game. So rod length, the standard's 1/28, and we are running 132 at the moment.
Yes. So that's some old school blokes call it a dog bone on the back of the suspension. You get a linkage, which is it's got a bell which connects to the swing arm, and then from the rear shock to the bell you have the linkage, which is what this is changing. And the linkage length, the longer it is, the further into the ratio of the progression. So if you think the reason they have a linkage rather than connecting straight to the swing arm, which is what KTM did for ages, is that the linkage allows for progression.
Okay.
So it can start plush and ramp up the damping further into the stroke, so therefore it can resist hitting the bottom out. The longer the rod is, the further into that progression curve you start. So technically, you're stiffening it.
Right, that makes sense.
But you're also lower in the chassis.
Okay.
So depending on the rod linkage change in real life, if you have like a 1 mil change, it can be like a 10 mil change at seat height.
Oh wow.
So that's set because it all adds up as it goes up through the bike. So that's obviously center of gravity is lower, so that can aid handling. It also means you're in a slightly more chopped out position, so you can go across braking bumps more, and it can also means you can lower the forks more again, so you can actually have more range of adjustment.
Okay.
So that's the purpose of it in real life. In this game, I find it just deadens the rear end a little bit more for me.
Yeah.
Like I said, first person view, I just want the ass to do what I want it to do, and I don't want to think about it. So, yeah, I do the longer linkage, and just this allows me to sort of hit the rough stuff without thinking I'm going to hit the rough stuff.
Yeah.
I can just pin it, brake, turn. I don't have to go, oh, I'm going to delicately tiptoe across this rough stuff because I don't know how the bike's going to react.
Yeah.
So it just allows that for me.
That makes sense. And then finally, last but not least, we've got engine mapping. So for the 250F, I always run aggressive simply because
Yeah.
although they're quick, they don't compare to the 450. They're just not that quick at all, and you
Yeah.
can get away with the aggressive mapping here.
It just livens it up.
Yeah.
The standard one's okay if it's raining, but even then, it's still it struggles to get out of its own way a little bit.
Yeah.
You just want that little bit of sort of extra caffeinated kind of rev, so just aggressive.
Yeah, I've never played about the slow setting for a 250F. I don't think there's any need to be honest.
Unless you want to lose to a 125.
Yeah, which is another rant about this game as well. We've got many of them. So it's amazing really how much you can change in the setup here. And again, it's just a game, it's just a simulator, but there is definitely something to be said to playing with some setups here for stability of the bike, and it shows how good the game is, because in any other motocross game, you're talking you're playing about some sliders, and it makes I can't tell any difference. You play the old MX versus ATV, MXGP games.
MX Supercross, me and you were like fiddling with settings for about 3 hours, and it didn't change our lap times one iota.
No, and it is a shame really that, again, this is another topic again. Hopefully something like this can become mainstream, like the F1 games, because this is what a lot of hardcore motocross riders want to play, I guess. And whether it does, I don't know. That's another topic entirely, because to the average person, they're not going to want to fuck about with any of this. They just want to ride, don't they? So perhaps a simulator around a casual setup could be the way, but it's a difficult market to break into.
Yeah, because we're quite niche.
Yeah, compared to F1.
If you go to we've both been to the Des Nations and Matterley Basin twice now.
Yeah.
I've been to a couple more. I've been to France. I've been to Donington Park, whatever. So you see a field with 60,000 people, 70,000 people. You think, wow, that's a lot of people. This is a big sport. But then in reality, it's tiny. It's a gnat's fart in the sort of big scheme of sport. So they have such a niche market to sell it to, and unfortunately, a lot of them don't want to put in the hours. They don't want a learning curve. They want to just pick up the controller and play, which I can't fault that. That's fair enough. It's just that there is a group of us who want a simulator, and who we would absolutely relish a mainstream game, which was the hardest thing known to man.
Yeah.
Because that's where the differentiation is between riders. Like if everyone can go fast on MX Supercross 3, everyone can go fast on it. It's down to who knows where the cheater lines are, and who just learns the glitches in the game that they can sort of preload more or carry more speed. Like remember the old MX versus ATV game? If you kept flicking the clutch, it would go faster. You get boosts constantly.
Lean back constantly.
Yeah. So stuff like that the average person doesn't really care about. But people like myself, who are a bit more anal retentive than the average, so to speak, then I just want more realism, and I don't care how hard it is, because that learning curve's what I want.
Yeah, and this game's amazing for that, and is something I want to set up in the future. We'll do some riding talks and maybe a podcast, and we'll do another one for the 450 as well. Maybe not as in depth, because you explained so much of the suspension settings here, which is great. But yeah, that's basically the bread and butter of setting up a KX250F. So if you guys like this, have a little look, have a little play, report back as well. See what you guys think, and if you've got any questions, we'll have a look and get Ben to answer them, and go from there. So thank you very much, Ben, for doing this.
Just to reiterate, don't be scared to play around with it. It's only a game. Remember what the standard is.
Don't be afraid.
Just fiddle about with it. Do the Google bracketing, suspension bracketing. Once you got that, you can set up your own suspension to suit you. This is just a generic, slightly better than stock, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. All right, guys, thank you very much for tuning in. We'll do another one soon. And cheers to Ben for doing this as well, because I wouldn't have had a fucking clue. I would have been lost. And I'll catch you guys next time.
Ta-da.